Princeton University, and the University of Toronto, and he currently teaches inmates at a correctional facility in New Jersey. I give you Christopher Hedges.
Thanks. I mean, John's right. We have so little time left. In theological terms, I can't escape my seminary background. This is literally a battle for life against the forces of death. Alexander Herzen speaking a century ago to anarchists about that their task was not to reform the system but to overthrow it, said, "We think we are the doctors, we are the disease." And that's precisely what we have to be if we are going to survive as a species. I covered movements around the globe, all of the revolutions in Eastern Europe, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Romania, all of the street demonstrations that brought down Slobodan Milosevic, the first Palestinian uprising or intifada, the second Palestinian uprising that took place about 5 years later. And I've learned that movements are organic. They have a life, a kind of centrifugal force that even the purported leaders of those movements do not understand or grasp. The fundamental task of the security and surveillance state, and all of these movements took place in states that had draconian forms of control, the Stasi in East Germany, for instance, although I would argue that at this point, the security and surveillance state in the United States is the most repressive apparatus and intrusive apparatus probably in human history. Their fundamental goal is to sever a movement which articulates the truth as Occupy did from the mainstream. And as probably some of you know in this room, I have been deeply critical of the Black Bloc. Now, let me preface that, first of all, by saying that that's not an attack on anarchism. I don't particularly like labels, but if you had one that you had to affix to me, it would certainly be as an anarchist. I believe in a permanent alienation from power, a perpetual conflict with centers of power, no matter who holds that power. I come out of the Julian Benda vision of the world, his 1922 book, Treason of the Intellectuals, that said that you can either serve privilege and power or justice and truth. But the closer that you go towards making concessions to those who serve privilege and power, the more you diminish the capacity for justice and truth. And my book, The Death of the Liberal Class, chronicles the destruction of populist and radical movements that were the force in this society that opened up democracy, that provided all the true correctives to American democracy. It never came from the white power elite, it came from the bottom. The Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, the civil rights movement. None of these movements achieved formal positions of power. And yet, in April 1968, one could argue that Martin Luther King was the most powerful figure in this country until his assassination, because when he went to Memphis, 50,000 people went with him. And what has happened to Occupy is that the external forces of repression have been matched by sophisticated and deep internal forces of repression. And the goal is to sever the movement from the mainstream, to make the mainstream frightened of the movement. What terrified the power elite were the mothers and fathers from the suburbs outside of New York showing up in Zuccotti Park with their strollers. Because they knew that if this movement spread, if it could begin to pull the kinds of numbers that I saw in Leipzig and Alexanderplatz and Wenceslas Square, the pillars, which are fragile, that hold up the systems of power, including the foot soldiers of the elite, the police, could be internally divided, and internal division creates paralysis. And so my criticism of the Black Bloc is not a criticism of violence. I'm not a pacifist. I was in Sarajevo during the war when it was being hit with 2,000 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day, 45 of my own foreign journalists killed. And we were surrounded by a trench system and understood that if the Serbs broke through that trench system, a third of the city would be slaughtered and the rest would end up in refugee and displacement camps. And that wasn't theory, because all we had to do was look at Vukovar or the Drina Valley. At that moment, I understand why you pick up a weapon. And yet, I believe that at this moment, our true power, as Václav Havel wrote, comes, whatever that incongruity is, from our powerlessness. I think that is our greatest weapon. We cannot compete internally or externally with the forces of the security and surveillance state that were on public display last night, because they can't allow this movement to take root again. Orwell said that all totalitarian societies rule through fraud and force, and now that fraud has been exposed, and force is all they have left. When I was in Leipzig, there would be candlelit vigils every week, run mostly out of the Lutheran Church, 70 people, 100 people, and then suddenly 70,000 people. Even the organizers of that movement didn't know why. At that moment, people broke through the barriers of fear implanted by the Stasi state to join them. And Eric Honecker, the dictator, called on an elite paratroop division to go down to Leipzig and fire on the crowd. And when those paratroopers got there, they refused. Honecker was gone within a week. It is the pillars. The corruption and rot within the corporate state is so extensive, and believe me, those within that elite understand how corrupt power is, how gained power is, far better than anyone in this room. And so do those cops, who for $37 an hour have to work as rent-a-cops or rent-a-security guards at places like Goldman Sachs, and watching these guys in their $8,000 suits walk by them as if they're invisible. The power we have comes through transparency, it comes through true democracy, it comes through consensus, and it comes through nonviolence. At this moment, that is the most potent weapon we have. And the security state will seek to paint us another way. Every act of violence is used by the propaganda machine to frighten the mainstream from joining the movement and justify brutal tactics of police repression. Never underestimate the power of the good to draw the good. When I was in Prague, covering the Velvet Revolution, every evening in the Magic Lantern Theater with Václav Havel and Klaus and all of those who would finally inherit the government of Czechoslovakia when the communists fell, there were posters throughout the streets of Prague of a student named Jan Panic, who in 1968, to protest the Soviet invasion of his country, lit himself on fire in Wenceslas Square, and 4 days later died of his burns. When students from Charles University joined the funeral procession, they were broken up by police. The event was never mentioned on the state-controlled media. When his grave became a shrine, they dug up his remains, cremated his body, gave the cremated urns to his mother, and told her that she was not allowed to bury them. 3 weeks after the government fell, 10,000 people were in Red Army Square to rename it in his honor. I was in Wenceslas Square with 500,000 people when Marta Kubashaya, who was Czechoslovakia's most popular singer, and in 1968 sang an anthem of defiance that saw her, once the communist regime was cemented back into place and Dubček was overthrown, turned into a non-person. Her recording stock was destroyed. Her voice did not appear on the airwaves. She survived by working in a factory that made toys on an assembly line. And when she walked out on that balcony on that winter's night and began to sing, every person around me knew every word. The power of truth, the power of love, not the sentimental love, but the love that Martin Luther King talked about. This is the power that Occupy has harnessed, and it is a power that terrifies the state. With that power, if we hold fast to it, I believe we have the capacity to bring these people down. Thank you.